contractors. We've all been hearing a lot about artificial intelligence technologies and about all the great things that they can do for us. And there is no denying that there is great advantage to utilizing artificial intelligence. But the big question is, especially with the group that we have on the line today that care about security and care about compliance, is can we take advantages of the good things about AI and still protect our intellectual property and our CUI? How do we protect our intellectual property against threat actors as well as from inadvertent loss? So this is all very critical, especially when we have to meet requirements like CMMC and DFARS. So our panelists today will go into some of these challenges, give some real-world examples, and suggest some strategies to mitigate these risks, while ensuring that we take advantage of the enhancements AI can bring and still do it safely and responsibly. As a bit of added interest today, we're going to have polling questions. Keep an eye out for them and give us your input. We'll give about 30 seconds for you to enter your thoughts, and then we'll post the results. So just a little bit of added interest. All users have been muted on entry, and so if you have any questions or if you have any thoughts, feel free to put them into the chat. And we will have a Q&A at the end of the webinar where we'll try and answer as many questions as we can that have been put into the chat. With that, let me introduce our esteemed group of panelists. We have James Mignacca, the CEO of Cavelo. Philip Zerke is a security analyst here at ISI. John Nolan is a VP of IT Services at ISI. And I'm Peter Romness. I'm your moderator today and VP of Partnership at ISI. To start out, James, could you give us a brief overview of Cavelo?
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and thanks to the ISI folks for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. So again, I'm James Mignacca, I'm the CEO of Cavelo. And what we do is we've created a platform that does the left of boom. And so that's the preventative breach side, and it helps out with regulatory compliance. And so what that is data discovery and classification. So what I always say is if you don't know where your data is, how are you going to protect it? And that's big on the regulatory compliance side. Then we tell you who has access to that data, which is all about zero trust. And again, part of regulatory compliance. We will then tell you where all your assets are when it comes to your attack surface management. And then we overlay vulnerability management. Why this is important is the 60,000 vulnerabilities out there. You can't remediate all of them, but we tell you where you need to remediate when it comes to your real risk, your real practical risk in your environment. That all rolls up into a risk profile that effectively tells you if you're breached today, tomorrow, what's your potential liability and what's the risk, the real risk of a breach, and where you should focus your time. And that's all part of risk management, best practices, and regulatory compliance.
Thanks, James. And John, could you give a brief overview of ISI?
Sure. We at ISI, we're a dual function MSP and MSSP. So the side of the house that's talking today is our MSP side, or managed service provider. We assist with compliance, CMMC, NIST 800-171, as well as help desk, engineering, and cybersecurity operations for our clients.
Thank you very much. So let's jump right in. And just as a level set, what is generative AI? And there's been a lot of discussion amongst the panelists about public versus private AI. So, Phil, could you go ahead and start off our discussion on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So to start off, I'd like to just address what AI is. I don't know what everyone's understanding is coming into this webinar. So AI, just in a simplistic form, is technology that lets computers simulate human intelligence and problem-solving capabilities, which is based on a neural network. Artificial intelligence also utilizes machine learning, which all machine learning is evaluating data for patterns, which they call training. Now, to get more into generative AI, generative AI is used to create new content in the forms of text, images, code, music, videos, etc. Now, to get more into public AI versus private AI, private AI is where data is kept to yourself. You have complete control over what data is being fed into your AI algorithms, and it's used within a closed environment or your organization. Whereas public on the other side, or public AI on the other hand, is where you're sharing data with everyone. Everyone has access. So algorithms that are developed are accessible to the public or multiple organizations.
I kind of like to say that AI is a helper. It's a great helper. It can do a lot of things that, just get rid of some of the busy work. I use it to get started when I'm writing something. If I'm doing research, I'll use it to look for things that I didn't even know I was looking for that it may come up with. So I see that as a great tool. But then again, there are some things you got to worry about with AI. So, John, if you could kind of address, the critical role that AI plays in the defense sector, and particularly, that's all of the things that this audience really cares about.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, AI, obviously, you'd have to be under a rock to not hear it in the last 6 to 8 months. But, at a time when some of us are still getting comfortable with the idea of cloud computing, when now we have AI layered on top of it, we have that introduced, and the applications really are endless, from fulfillment of your contracts to protection of your environment to maintaining and understanding your current compliance posture. All things that AI can assist with. Phil mentioned earlier about patterns and how AI works to identify those, and that's really one of the critical places where AI can engage and help with your compliance management, making sure you're staying CMMC certified. That's one thing that's missed quite a bit, is that these audits and assessments and really compliance posture as a whole is not a one-time thing. You have your one audit every 3 years, but in between you're expected to maintain that compliance. And with 110 controls, 320 objectives, you can extrapolate that out and understand pretty easily how quickly that can become really hard to maintain and understand drift for. So, obviously AI is still an emerging technology at this point, and its applications are not clearly defined, but we expect to see it integrated really at every level. But that's where the more important part about vetting and properly understanding the technology and how it works, so that you're not introducing vulnerabilities or other issues throughout your environment.
Can I add on to that a little bit?
Yeah,
Please do.
Yeah, so just use cases in like a defense contracting sense. Like you said, there's plenty of applications, but like in a cyber aspect, a lot of automation, such as like parsing through cyber intelligence data or open source data to find potential needles in the haystack, that could potentially lead to indicators of compromise way faster than any human analyst could. So it's going through data on data like so fast that it can make decisions and notify you way faster, as well as enhanced situational awareness in like an intelligence and surveillance way, where you can analyze data from multiple sources, identify patterns, and then develop strategic planning based on that. So AI can simulate multiple scenarios and predict potential outcomes, which can save time and money for organizations.
Exactly. Yeah. And, the predict thing makes some people nervous, but, the truth is AI has been up to this point utilized in a way that's, those what's the word I'm looking for? Those predictions, we'll say, end up being extremely accurate just because of the amount of data it's pulling in, evaluating, and how it's evaluating it. Any person looking at data sheets is eventually going to get a little fatigued, or they're going to, need a cup of coffee, and they may miss a connecting point. But, with these AI tools, it can evaluate those on such a scaled level, and really catch anything that's popping out at it. So it's definitely something that's at every stage of the game.
Hey, John, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in there and
Sure.
and go at a different angle. In discussions, and I totally agree 100%. I mean, AI is very powerful. I'll just point out machine learning has been around since the 1800s, so this is not new. It's just more the application which is being used, and it's really the chatbots that we're so used to. And I've heard about really good things around creating policies and also analyzing policies to controls, and that's all great. My only caveat there is, we have to also build in the guardrails to make sure there's a human checking the overall, the end result. And I've had discussions at length about this, and I think that, like anything on the internet, we can't just trust it entirely or explicitly. I like the whole warning of, do you accept, right? And it's like making sure that you are going through and looking for the integrity, making sure it's done properly. Because one of the things, and I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about later, is you can poison the learning model slightly, and that's something that in discussions with folks, it's something that it's not happened today, but again, it's like we still have to make sure that there's the human factor in place, and making sure that
Right.
it's just what Peter said, leveraged as a tool versus trusting it to a point where it's just another human.
No doubt about that. I mean, a very funny example. If you've used Google's AI in the last couple months, there's headlines came out that they didn't really curate very well the areas that Google's AI was going to learn from. So you'd ask questions, and the funny piece of it was they included Reddit as a resource, which is very well-known snarky type website. And so some of the responses that Google's AI was given were flavored by this sarcasm drenched website, and the results were really interesting. And that really gets down to the private and public of it that Phil was talking about earlier. I'd say, curating, your machines are learning, but you need to curate where those machines are learning from and ensure the results.
Yeah, and to add on to that, like you said, circling back to private versus public, in a government contracting, you might be more pushed towards the private sector or private side of AI versus public, because I know we're going to talk about it later, but you're pulling from repositories that could be potentially malicious. They could have insecure code, they could have malware. So you run the risk of putting that into your work environment. You got to be careful about which avenue you go down.
And you run the risk of your work environment going into the training data if you're using public.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yep.
Yeah, so your IP becomes part of the training and becomes everybody's IP at that point.
Yeah, I think it's just worthwhile mentioning, if you go and if you look at any source on the internet, you look for the citing or the reference, right? It's like you can do your critical research because you know where this information is coming from. And although with some of the chat GTP, like the different sources, you still need to go back and look at that integrity piece and making sure that it meets your requirements to what Peter had said too.
Okay, moving on to the next discussion point. For this audience, we're very interested in in DoD and meeting our requirements, and that's one of the main things that we're talking about here. So, James, I'm going to start with you on this one, and everybody else feel free to chime in. But could you give us some guidance on how to integrate AI solutions effectively and get all the benefit that they offer while still maintaining our compliance requirements?
Yeah, sure. I will attempt to answer that. I don't think there's a clear answer. I'm going to reference discussions I've had, but I think one of the challenges is AI, the way that we interpret it today, not machine learning from the previous context. Um, it's kind of creeped us up on us, and certainly what I think is that regulatory compliance really hasn't adopted it, or they haven't taken that into consideration, and so that's going to happen, right? And so if you think about the NIST AI risk management framework, they're really trying to do this, and I think that although any framework, this one's at the starting phase. It's fairly loose. I think there's some takeaways when it comes to kind of the best practice that they're putting together, and so just a couple thoughts there. When you look at their framework, or I would argue a lot of different frameworks, it's really around understanding and taking inventory of what is using AI, right? And so what's using AI and what the usage is. And so I like to talk about the due diligence kind of checklist, right? So not only is it the usage from an internal perspective of your employees, which I know we're going to talk about later, but you think about all the vendors out there. Like you really don't know what's using AI, like your phone, the new Apple updates using it. And so I always like to start with the discovery phase, right? So understanding and making sure that you have a process in which when you onboard new technology, both from a vendor perspective, supply chain perspective, and internal, make sure you understand what AI usage is in your organization, and then taking a step back and understanding the use case, and then the stakeholders. So, for example, you don't have to have it so that AI is being used by your entire employee base, right? It's kind of like that zero trust that we keep hearing about. It also applies to AI as a whole, and then reporting to the stakeholders, right? And so if making sure that you understand, do we understand the need and the why, and does it make sense, and making sure there's accountability. And then there's the continually monitoring and reviewing of that. And so reading through this, if you think about regulatory compliance and your threat landscape, this is exactly what best practice is, right? And so I think AI is just going to be a subset of your threat landscape, right? It's going to be considered a risk that you inherently accept, and you put guardrails around, right? So if you think about vulnerabilities, it's going to just be that, right? And you measure your risk, and you try to that zero trust and hone in on who really should have access instead of letting everyone have access in your organization. And then I'm going to switch topics slightly and talk about how this has changed when it comes to the bad actors. And it's important to look at it from both perspectives. So if you think about AI, in the previous to AI and the chatbots, the malicious actors would go to the dark web to get malware. You could actually lease it, and bots and things like that. And so now there is unethical, it's called Worm GPT, that's being used for unethical actors. And basically what they do is they can go and create malware on the fly. And so we talk about malware being used from a positive perspective. Now this is being used from a negative perspective, and it's really effective, right? And so that's the scary part of AI, and something that we need to take into account. And you see it now. I'm sure we all get the emails right now from spear phishing campaigns and that are happening, and they're more effective now than ever. And then we talked a little bit about this. I think Phil brought it up, which is the fact that you can poison a learning model. And so the way they do it is they don't corrupt the entire model. They change some of the data so it's either biased, but it doesn't get picked up by the human. And so these are things that we need to source again, and we need to understand, and do our research and making sure that we just don't blindly accept what AI is giving us. I think taking a step back and kind of coming to my conclusion when it comes to the challenges and how we should be kind of adopting AI is we got to look at it just as another potential risk in our threat landscape, and we need to add it to what we're doing from a best practice standpoint today. Discover, make sure you understand what's being used in your organization, the use cases, talk to the stakeholders, make sure someone's accountable, and it's going to be multiple people depending on the use case, and then monitor that from an ongoing basis.
To piggyback off of your discussion on like the actors and attacks being done through AI, phishing and social engineering, that's how most breaches of data occur and compromises to accounts. And all that being automated, so it's easier to bypass email security gateways and stuff like that. It's just on the rise. Year after year after year, it's increased. And it's not anything complex. It's just not making simple spelling mistakes, using domains that, like Gmail, where they have DKIM, DMARC, SPF, and then as well as using AI to create deepfakes. I'm sure everyone's seen videos of celebrities or politicians having quotes, being stated that they're saying, but they actually didn't, because it takes about 2 seconds of a voice recording you can now make any edit you want with that and make, political statements. It could only potentially get worse. And then, good.
Oh, it was interesting when James talked about zero trust, because the idea of zero trust is as granularly as possible, protecting every asset or in your organization, and assets include your people, your devices, and things like that, and making a risk-based decision before you allow that access. And so the threat actors using AI needs to be figured in when you create your risk-based decisions. Who can go to what assets, what different ways can different people or devices speak to the outside world and get information. And so that goes into your risk-based decisions. And then the ability to mitigate on those risks is where positive AI threat hunting comes into effect. So using AI to find threats faster, to identify bad emails, to correlate data from different types of your defenses. So your DNS service may say, hey, this is a risky risky website, and then your threat indication or your endpoint may say, oh, this is a bad file. And then when you start bringing all those things together, you can get a bigger picture, and AI really helps in that analysis. So it's both taking in your risk-based decisions and also using it to take action against those threats is where it really can help.
And then one last thing on data privacy, especially if you're dealing with a more public AI infrastructure, that's where the mitigations of ensuring that who has access to the data consent, proper data classifications, is it sensitive data, making sure that that's not making it into a public cloud or a public AI. Is it classified? Having a data inventory, stuff like that, making sure that where your data is at all times and who has access to it, more importantly.
Yeah, and that zero trust comes in there, right? Because Phil, at the end of the day, if you have sensitive information that shouldn't be on a public chat GPT, you really want to probably take that access away or limit it or scope it. And there's ways you can tie into the API and all that stuff and all that good stuff. But yeah, I totally agree.
Okay. Moving along, I know Phil and James, you guys were both very interested in giving the GitHub Copilot as a case study, and it really does drive home many of the things that we've been talking about today. Can you fill the folks in on what you're talking about?
I could start with Copilot if you want, Phil.
Yeah,
Just
go ahead.
kick that off. And so I actually, this is a talking point for me in many discussions, and it's just to set the tone. This is not specific to Copilot. It applies to Google and all different chatbots, but it's an example of how easy it is to expose data when you don't necessarily want to or know it's being exposed. And so if you think about Office 365, and we've all done this, where you have a file and you want to share it out with someone. There's an option there to share it. If you think about Word doc, you hit share, really easy to do. You can actually add someone in, which is the right thing to do. So you're basically, it's kind of that zero trust. No one has access. You're adding someone. But the lazy way is to just share out the URL. And so if you share out the URL, the whole idea is if I give Peter that URL, if whoever has that URL has access to that file, right? And so the challenge there is that Peter can share it with Phil and Phil can share it with John, and then more people have access. But with Copilot, if you enable Copilot and you're not ensuring that the proper data or sensitive data or the data you care about has that explicit permissions, then Copilot goes and it basically digests all this information. And so another example would be my CFO shares out a document with me by sharing just that URL, has all the salaries of my employees, and someone in my company just goes to Copilot and looks up, types in what's Bob's salary. And this is a real life scenario where you could actually get that information without really knowing that this has been exposed, right? Now it's internal. I did one talk and some guy came up to me after and said, is this external? No, it's just your employees. But it's an example of how AI has enabled this type of fluid information to be out there. And so, you have to be pragmatic before just enabling AI, right? And so, we call it Copilot Readiness Report, understand the permissions, making sure that and there's ways that you can actually drill down with Copilot, with Copilot, and you could create certain specific rules for certain employees. And that's all the stuff that you need to do before you actually just blindly enable AI.
And to add on to that, just to get more specific to the GitHub Copilot and why this is a good example of malicious use of public AI is what GitHub is. It's a repository for open source code, and it also does version control. But with the introduction of Copilot, it went out and it pulls all public repositories. So users, when they create these, they can either post it as private or they can post it as public. What it did was it pulled all public repositories, and that includes anybody that's created or posted code that has that's malicious, insecure, that contains vulnerabilities. And once this happened, it introduced, I think that they said that the number was like there was a 60% increase of vulnerabilities due to insecure code, which could potentially be linked to this GitHub Copilot. So while it does automate and make things faster, there is a risk because you're trusting other people doing the right thing, which, humans being your biggest attack surface, that's not always the best thing.
It's not our strong suit.
No.
And the GitHub thing, if you think about it, and Peter said it properly at the very beginning, it should be used to leverage as a tool. You still need to do the check. I don't think it's wrong to use AI to help writing and developing code, but you need to you have to go through that code to make sure there's not malicious activity within it, like malware or things like that. I've also seen concerns about even copyright. right? So if you think about it from a copyright standpoint, that's also a concern where, other people, the same people could be using the exact same code. Taking a step back, you can't explicitly just use AI without the human factor.
Yeah, and we've seen all these problems in the news, not necessarily with code and things, but you saw the lawyer that filed a brief that totally made up its references. You've seen, where copyright infringement was in an article that somebody wrote, and now the publisher is going after them legally. All of those things can happen with code. It can, and just apply it to whatever you're working with AI. And so it's, careful what you take out, and you got to really know what's going into the model.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about supply chain now. That's becoming a bigger and bigger thing, and that's really kind of how you can look at the use of AI, or at least understanding where the machine learning piece comes from. Like we mentioned earlier, everything going in could possibly come out, and vice versa. So really taking the time up front to vet and properly map out and configure any AI tool you're using to make sure that all its references, all the places it's looking, and all the places it's sending are those that you're comfortable, okay with, and meet regulatory compliance is the most important first step.
Yeah, we used to say garbage in, garbage out. Now it's like garbage in and a whole lot of garbage out. If
right,
it just magnifies it.
You see two sides. There's people on both sides of the spectrum. Like there's people who are so anti-AI because they think that it's going to steal jobs, or they're anti-AI because they don't think it does anything. Whereas I think the truth's in the middle. Whereas if you utilize AI, it's just going to make your job faster, more effective.
Yeah, it's a force multiplier that can't be ignored, really.
Yeah.
But it's also something that's hyper popular right now, and not 100% understood by everybody using it. So that welcomes, unfortunately, bad actors. They see shifts like this in the ecosystem, and they latch on to it directly because they know there's going to be a lot of people new to the technology that may or may not have had time to really understand it back and forth, and that's where they'll scoot in to make their play.
Yeah, I agree. There's no way you can not use AI, and I've talked to folks who try to explicitly not use AI in their organization, and there's just no way. So I think taking a more pragmatic approach is the right angle.
Yeah, I mean, apologies, I don't know who it was, but one of you mentioned earlier, that even if you're not using AI direct, it's like when people don't want to use the cloud, they don't want to store their data in the cloud, and it's like I get it, that's your choice, but also know that down the supply chain, cloud is still in part of that. So every company and every step of the supply chain at this point is either using AI actively or evaluating where they can use it. So if you're not using it, if you've decided you don't want to use AI for your company and that's the best path forward, awesome. But just remember that other people on the chain up and down will still be using it. So it's still helpful to really understand and plan.
I think it's funny you say that, John, because what like we're talking about using AI in your organization, but it's on your phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
GPT's right there, and I know for a fact people are using it for as simple as emails, right? So if they're going to use it no matter what, right? So it's almost like BYOD, like it's expanded, and that's why I really think it's important to not look at this as a separate problem or a challenge, or it's just another part of your threat landscape that needs to be taken into consideration from a risk standpoint, and you can't fight it. There's no way you can fight it. It's just everywhere, right?
Right. And I think in the next slide that we're getting into, Adam, Peter, if you want to introduce that, there are some points that relate back to that as well. I'll touch on.
Yeah, so just jumping into I put the slide up a little bit early. I apologize, but we've touched on many of the considerations about AI, and I'm sure folks are starting to say, okay, I understand now, but how do I get started? So Do you have any suggestions, and what would the panel say would be some good suggestions to get started on the journey of artificial intelligence and using it to their benefit and watching out for the perils?
No, absolutely. I mean, the nice thing is that the groundwork, the foundations that have already been laid for non-AI technology apply the same way. We don't have to reinvent the wheel to evaluate AI. We have to, educate ourselves on what the important parts are and understanding how things go together. But at the end of the day, the established RMF or risk management framework controls and processes will do everything you need to make sure that you can use AI and use it in a safe manner. We spoke a little bit earlier about supply chain. That's going to be, and I'm sure most everybody on this call in the last 6 months, either you or a close coworker has received a spreadsheet from either a prime or a government client asking about your supply chain risk management program or supply chain risk study. It's going to be a bigger thing as time goes. We mentioned earlier that the supply chain is the prime way for a bad actor to get up to some of the bigger guys and really infiltrate their networks. So understanding who's using AI, understanding if you're using AI internally, that it does have to meet the same requirements as other solutions. January this year, we got the DoD memo about FedRAMP moderate or equivalent requirements for any cloud service providers, for anybody in the CMMC ecosystem, really. And that, depending on how the AI is being used, that could also extend to an extended service provider. So let's say you're not just using a tool like ChatGPT or something, but you've employed a firm that's going to come in and use AI tools to help you do X, Y, Z. Those external service providers need to be certified and vetted as well. The outside of that, making sure that data lines are documented clearly. If you have AI, you want to know where its tentacles are going out to, and you want to document that in your company's IT documentation, your network design diagram and data flow diagram. Things like that, I think are and I'll leave some for the rest of you, but I think those are probably your main steps to start out.
I think one of the big ones that you said was the data boundary. What is AI going to actually touch? But I think another thing is, while this does introduce a new attack surface, I think best practices should always be, address your current cybersecurity protections. Make sure your password policies updated. Your data privacy is always addressed. Make sure that your security awareness training is always done, because, like I said, the attacks, they're not becoming more complex; they're just becoming more often. So social engineering and phishing is more likely to occur.
Yeah, I would even add to that regularity, regularity to your processes. Whether that's weekly or biannually, but just make sure that anything that has to do, and really it's past AI, anything that has to do with compliance is checked up on again. Those data boundaries, you want to confirm that they're still where you expect them to be, that any changes that have gone through are shown in the documentation, because that's the quickest way to get to a day or two before an audit and realize that you got big problems on your hands. Let's say you've done a pre-audit assessment, you've gone through a CMMC remediation process, you're good to go, and then your audit's not for another year down the road, or even 6 to 8 months. Well, a lot can happen in that time, and if that's documentation, if those evaluations are set and forgot about, you could be looking at some major changes by the time you sit down. So working that regularity in and documenting the change management of it all, is definitely a key point. James, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing in a different way. And which is great. I just want to go back to kind of where I started, which is, and I'll say this exactly what Phil said. This is just part of your threat landscape. Nothing, as long as you have a security practice in place, making sure that you add in the diligence to understand what AI is being used for is absolutely critical. We talked about boundaries and guardrails. The APIs will tell you what, for example, Copilot has access to. That is that Copilot readiness report that we talked about. You know, and I say this because I don't want people to think that, you know, oh my goodness, this is more work. This should just be effective. Keep doing what you're doing, but do it more. Like what John said. You know, the fact is that the bad actors just got smarter by leveraging AI. So we have to, from a defense standpoint, be smarter and more diligent around making sure that we have the defense mechanisms in place, which are all well known, right? You know, making sure training is done. 80% of breaches happen because of the people on this call, because they click those emails, and we're all guilty of it. And now they're going to get more sophisticated. Vulnerability management, guys, this is something that we've been doing for almost, 10 years, right? You know, there's well-known vulnerabilities out there that we just need to make sure they're remediated, because the bad actors are using that as a way into your organization, right? And so making sure you have the policies and the boundaries in place, all that stuff that, we've been talking about for the last, 5+ years. Now it's like we have to make sure everyone's doing that in order to guard against, the bad actors and the threats that are only going to be heightened now. But on the other side, we talked about some really good stuff in using AI, and I don't want to take away from that, right? So, we as a whole, we're never going to get away from AI. It's there to stay. We have to embrace it. We have to be pragmatic. And so, I look at it like, just take it as another a threat vector, and make sure that you raise the awareness and the accountability, and just keep doing more of what we're doing to guard against malicious activity.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I remember a long time ago, a friend of mine who was a security person in DoD, when wireless was coming out, he made this bold statement in a meeting that he would never allow wireless communication on a DoD network. To the then Secretary of Defense, or to the CIO of Defense. And the little hint about when this was, she said to him, we need to talk after the meeting, and pulled him aside and said, that is a career limiting thing you just said. The tool is more powerful, and there's more of a need for the tool than the risk that it imposes, and we will find a way to make it work. So you're not going to stop AI, but it does need to come into account when you're making your risk decisions, and you want to make sure that you have the defense, your defense capabilities using AI. If you're using, say, an MSP, you want to make sure that they're using AI as part of their mitigation or detection and mitigation. So anything else, folks?
Not for me, I don't think.
Yeah.
So we purposely left 15 minutes to take questions. If anybody has questions, will you please type them into the chat, and we'll address them as well as we can. And so we have one question from Scott on how do you anticipate the regulatory landscape for AI in DoD compliance to evolve over the next 12 months?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really going to be an expansion, or more of a definition period, let's call it. Because the standard as it is, there's nothing that precludes AI from being included in that. Like I mentioned earlier, with the FedRAMP equivalency and the CMMC certification levels. I think what we'll see is a lot of verbiage and a few memos here and there about how to understand its relation directly with the current controls. But outside of that, I think it's pretty much well accounted for as of now.
Yeah, I'll add to that, John. In my discussions, and just taking a step back, I know I talked about the NIST AI risk management framework as being, one, and as it relates to AI as a whole. But this is going to be taken into consideration with all regulatory compliance, right? But we know regulatory compliance is always, it takes a while. So we're going to see amendments. It's already in discussion right now. But it's going to take time because we don't know the cause and effect. And unfortunately, there's going to be things that happen that are going to be taken into account where we just need to learn from. And so I envision in the next 3 to 5 years, there's going to be amendments explicitly around AI in all regulatory compliance. And it's going to be the guardrails that we talked about. And it's going to be just written right in there.
Yeah, it looks like Brandon Edwards is asking if we see DoD regulatory compliance leaning more towards automation versus AI specifically. Any thoughts on that, James?
Yeah, I think I would argue so the challenge I have with that is we're all hung up on the verbiage AI from a marketing perspective. Like I said before, machine learning's been around since the 1800s. That is automation at its best, right? And so I think they're one of the same. And I think that it starts with that automation piece. And so, what are we trying to do, right? We're trying to be more efficient. We're trying to act faster. And so I think what's going to happen is going to be a discussion or a whole piece on its own, and it's going to dovetail into machine learning and AI. It just has to, right? Because at the end of the day, like automation is done by humans, right? And so if you think about AI, there's different aspects of AI. There's mechanical AI, which is done by humans, right? It's just understanding that learning piece, and it just makes it go faster. So to answer the question, I think it's one of the same. I think it is a starting point discussion around automation and the why and the use case, which is a good conversation. It's going to have to happen. And then it's just going to be around using platforms like AI to expedite that, or machine learning, all of the same.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'd see, really with the automation part of it, I think that is somewhere that it will focus up. Really one of the first refocuses or deep dives that they'll go into is the actual setup, the configuration, the pre-deployment vetting. Like we mentioned just a few minutes ago, the supply chain is a very big hot button topic. And with AI's capabilities being not fully understood by a regular person that's picking up an AI tool and understanding where it's going, they're really going to want to make sure people aren't using the tool to save time or automate processes without doing their due diligence ahead of time, almost cutting corners to get to the quicker solution. So that baseline benchmarking and configuration piece, as well as the documentation of what is touching and what that approval process is, I think will be another big part of it.
Yeah, and you can't just you can't, what we used to call it, you can't blame the users. Most users who cause a breach are oftentimes trying to do their job more efficiently, and they don't know when they're doing something wrong, and they don't know that the email they got that looks like it's from their boss is not actually from their boss. So, a lot of the regulation is backup for the users, and a lot of it is making sure that you have your bases covered to protect the data, even if the user doesn't see it. So it's not all about the user, and it's about having the technology to back up the user and make sure that everything's safe. And you see that when you look at the regulations.
And I'll just say this, Peter, I totally agree. But humans make mistakes.
Yep.
Right? So we're going to leverage this to make less mistakes. So it's the positive side of like automation,
Exactly.
AI, machine learning, all that stuff. Because it's just a known fact, right? And so again, yeah, to your point, Peter, I agree. And I think we also need to spin it on its back and look at it from the positive side as well.
Yeah, it's a team sport.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think this one will be more James and Phil. I'll let the subject matter experts speak on this. But Sergey, I'd like to know, what are the safest applications for AI, and what type of AI is the safest? CNN, RNN classifiers, or LLM-based tools?
I can start. So what are the safest applications for AI? It's kind of a broad question because each one kind of presents their own pros and cons. So like say ChatGPT for instance, it's not going to let you create anything malicious. Like if you say, hey, create me a phishing script, what do they call it? It's the prompt generation is eliminated. They've removed malicious prompts from being created. And then going to the CNN, RNN, and large language models, again, each one specializes in a certain task, right? So one's a little bit better for text generation or imaging and videos, stuff like that. So James,
what I think is going to happen in the near future, and it's already in discussion, is there's this concept of agents, and agents are built specifically for specific tasks, right? And you can do public, private, and I think that's where, and I consider them like a container, right? So you have an agent that's for policies, for example, and so you create policies, and then you create specific guardrails around that. And so the guardrails could be, do I accept the policy? The other one that I know policy or AI is being used for, and I think it's in a good way, is aligning policies with the gates or the specific actions that need to happen from an audit standpoint. And so I think what's going to inherently happen, and Google's kind of doing this with the agents, is we're going to see there's going to be agents for use cases, and there's going to be guardrails around that. And if you do research, we're already there. You could already start to do that. So the future is going to push us into that way of thinking anyways. But when it comes to like Chat GPT as a whole, I like to think of it like anything you put in anything public on the internet, just imagine people will see it, right? I say this as a whole, right? Just imagine if you're putting something there, just go with the frame of mind that it's out there, right? And so that's kind of there's going to be also some training around that. And when it comes to the whole private side, that's a bigger discussion, and certainly just having private learning models, and that's kind of where my agent piece comes into play. There's specific use cases there, and I think that's inherently where we're going to go when it comes to real sensitive information and specific use cases. But we're going to see AI mature, and all this stuff is going to happen when it comes to the big 5 companies that are effectively hosting AI, right? And so I truly believe AI will be leased through the big players like Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera, and they're going to push us in that direction. So it's just going to happen on its own.
I think financially, they're going to be the guys that can pay for the amount of computing power that's needed to also fuel, a lot of these. Because if it's going to interact with lots of data's got to be somewhere. So, like you said, I think that the Amazon, the Microsofts, the big guys in the field are going to be the ones that have the money to push it towards that.
Yeah, it's funny because there's always this innovation curve, right? It starts off like this, plateaus like this, because the big players come in and they monetize it, and we're just going to lease the bots from them, right? There's going to be specific use cases. It's going to be like Amazon EC2. It's like, okay, I want a server. It's like cloud computing. Like when cloud computing first came out, we were all talking about like, what is it? How are we going to use it? We're all intimidated by it. But now it's clear to us. And so that's just going to happen. And then certainly what's going to happen is regulatory compliance is just going to accept that, and it's going to be part of all the verbiage and the checklists and the audits.
Yeah. So with that, we're nearing the end of our time. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today, and thank you to our panelists. You guys, this was really interesting. I want to remind you that this was videoed and recorded, and a link to the video will be sent at the conclusion of the webinar. So thank you for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.